Shinji and Warhammer 40k. Chapter 32. Uncertain Space. Part 2.
The sound was unmistakable, the deep chut-chut-chut noise of a massive turning gear, and the ripping noise as countless humming blades ripped through air. It was a happy sound. At least it made her happy. There was a flash of red and a flash of white, and a sensation of two absolutely monstrous things slamming into each other. The shock was enough to jar her back into wakefulness. Asuka Langley Soyu very reluctantly decided to acknowledge the morning. She usually slept in on Sundays. In the end, however, a combination of hunger and the baking heat of the sun from her window would drive her from the bed before 9 o'clock. She yawned, absently scratching the underside of her breast as she entered the living room. Asuka had lived with Masato for the better part of a year already, and people were starting to notice disturbing resemblances. At least it was a safe bet they would have similar figures some years on. For the moment, while she still regarded Masato as totally unsuitable as a role model, Asuka did understand a little about the convenience of a liquid breakfast. Her mind was stuck in a loop, trying to reclaim that particularly intense dream she was having. She remembered nothing about it, except that it was intense. She went over to the fridge and took out a bottle of milk. Pen, another late riser, made a protest.
What goes out when doors closed, girl?
Asuka made apologies and let him get back to sleep. Such was the peril of routine that no one, not even the penguin, thought anything about it was odd. At least the refrigerator was no longer quite so filled with beer. Since Masato's bumped up the pay grade, she'd bought another cooler simply for that purpose. Asuka took a swig and let the liquid blunt the hunger. She let out a belch, then another louder one, and looked embarrassed. Fortunately, there was no one else there to know. Asuka frowned. That was actually odd. Where's Ayanami? Ray woke up at 5:30 every morning without fail. It was fortunate that while she disliked meat, it apparently didn't extend as far as eggs. Asuka's dislike of people who let themselves be used as tools took a rack from a clue by 4, in that a world with too many people exactly like her would shortly become unmanageable. There was also something to be said for having someone utterly predictable serving in a supporting role. Unsurprisingly, what with Ray's unwillingness to raise any complaint, all it meant that the Katsuragi household seemed to have gotten itself a maid. Then again, that was the function Shinji Ikari served while he lived there. Asuka took smaller, more demure sips from the milk bottle. That dream. Her old nightmares had recently been fading in face of real horrors and worst-case possibilities, and there were a few enjoyable fantasies. But she'd never really dreamt something of such weight before. She heard a humming noise from behind her, a rough sort of melody, and turned around. Milk spurted out of her nose, as her sense of reality failed to comprehend what she was seeing. Ray was humming. The tune was Another One Bites the Dust. She held a long-handled broom and along with the pleasant pitch presented such a picture of serene domestic bliss. She looked up and bowed slightly. You are a rake, Pilot Soyu. I shall prepare breakfast momentarily.
It's... What the Ayanami!
Asuka gasped out.
What the hell are you wearing?
Ray blinked and looked down. I am merely preparing for Pilot Ikari's return. I have been told by Sister Ibuki that this is the proper garb suited for such a welcome. Asuka twitched. It wouldn't actually be a surprise to think Maya may have some cosplaying tendencies. What irked her was how that seemed such a perfect fit for Ayanami's servile personality. Admittedly, it was a modest attire, with a long skirt reaching down to the ankles, padded shoulders, and frills were limited to the sleeve ends and that fluffy white tiara-like thing that was part of the effect. Still, the contrast between Ray's pale skin and light blue hair was striking. Asuka knew it was much harder to find contrast with her own red-orange hair. Maybe a dark green version of the outfit. Soyu? Ray tilted her head a bit, puzzled. Are you unwell? Asuka touched her hand to her nose, and what she thought was merely milk up the wrong pipe stained her fingers red. Her eyes widened.
No way! No fucking way!
She looked up and glared.
I can't possibly have a maid fetish!
Ray approached, her expression showing only concern. How detestable, perhaps, to be so weak by choice, perfectly submissive. A toy, a tool, something to be used and discarded, yet still so eager to please. A part of Asuka's mind noted that the female counterpart of master is mistress. Ray reached out with a slim, unmanicured hand towards Asuka's face. The red-haired girl slapped that away.
Stay away from me!
She shrieked. Very faintly, Ray looked hurt. Asuka twitched again.
I'm fine. Leave me alone.
She bolted back into her bedroom. Ray blinked again as Asuka slammed the partition shut. After a while, she gave a small shrug and put away the empty bottle of milk into the recyclables bin. What an odd person, she said, punctuated by the sound of clinking glass. Trident Base was thick with tension. It wasn't enough that NERV, the regular military, and the UN strategic forces had to continually scuffle over jurisdiction. The prefectural defence forces had to beware of old grudges against the Chinese volunteer troops, while they both looked upon with wariness the Russians there as instructors and line support with their weird tanks. Then, all three of them were cautious of the mercenary troops, not just because they were sworn to no national authority, but that with their armour on the Greeks and Turks and assorted other cell soldiers could pound on just about anybody. Add to that the Tibetans, who had old history against the Chinese, and holding an undisguised contempt for the Russian psychoactive program. The others tried to pretend that nothing mountain primitives said outside of their duties as human targeting aids would actually matter. And all of them distrusted NERV. The feeling was mutual all around. Yet they all kept their competitive natures in check, standing by to fight and die for a place that wasn't really theirs. The Chinese would have, literally, climbed the tallest mountain and forged the deepest rivers to get to their hero, Yang. The Russians behaved, mindful of that, and trying to learn from a former enemy. The Japanese defenders knew they held situational advantage, but unlike, say, Gendo, many people would care if either Yang or young Ikari were injured or killed. The Javali monks and the Legio Terminata were ready to avenge the slightest insult, but knew they were even more isolated. The flow of history was still a debated point, whether or not it's forced into shape by great men, or that historical forces merely produce great leaders whenever necessary. Regardless, when it comes to most military, morale was a significant factor towards performance. Thus, when the call went out to gather in parade formation, no one dawdled. No one wanted the shame of being last to arrive and offering disrespect. Every single one of them felt charged up for some reason. The base commander squinted at the early morning sun, struck numb with sudden pride, seeing the Allied forces standing at the ready. Oh, it was time. He grinned fiercely. It was time to get their game on. The monks of Javao lived away from the base, taking over one of the old abandoned Buddhist temples nearby. The Terminator custodes were hired as Shinji Ikari's personal guard, but had stepped back to let NERV Section 2 handle most of the city work. This was because very few of them actually spoke Japanese, or even fit through the doors sized for the comparatively much shorter locals. Special heavy-duty trucks brought in sworn troops. Golden Giants, Silvered Knights, and the Psychics with their funny conical hats. They stepped to join the formation, metal boots sending the tarmac ringing. Boom! Boom! The ground began to shake. Trident Base and the gathered forces there faced towards the morning sun. This was slightly uncomfortable, but at least the troops wouldn't be covered by Magnos Tancred's shadow. Several VTOLs, painted red, landed nearby. It was the entire fighting complement of the 1st Hakone Prefectural Defence Forces, and half the workers. They pulled no stops for that display of solidarity, but even so, their assets were at best half that of the short regiment attached to the Earth's cradle. Few in number, great at heart, Colonel Nasuno stepped onto an impromptu wooden platform, and as one they saluted. The simultaneous tap of 5,000 shoes and boots and one massive mechanical leg sent the air reverberating. He saluted back, but held it. He turned around to face two figures walking up the back steps of the platform. They were still civilians, but saluted back. Only when their fingers dropped could everyone else relax. At the back towered the still menacing, sloping figure of the Trident Land Dreadnought, in a configuration befitting the name, all heavy weapons. Below and in front, the many technicians and engineers responsible for the continued operation of Trident Base, clad in white, red and green depending upon their specific specialities. On either side were the Basilisk Mobile Artillery, described in the Tokyo Free newspaper as large fuck-off cannons, 20 of them total. Spreading out in an angle even further out, 16 of the modified VTOL gunships were arranged as like a ring. Their Knowles Vulcan cannons were replaced with a single oversized barrel, as the first aircraft in history to be fitted with true combat-worthy laser cannons. 8 of the Lehman Russ heavy tanks were formed into a block at the far left, with their 5-man crews standing before their proud beasts. The smaller and more numerous MBTs, APCs, and various other combat vehicles were arranged around them. A small force of volunteers for the visiting forces were lined up nearby, clad in black greatcoats. The next block was composed of Chinese visiting forces, 2 platoons of fresh-faced young soldiers, the elite of the graduating class out from the schools that Yang founded. In addition to their standard bolt rifles, there are also teams with heavy bolters, scouts and demolition specialists, snipers, and every possible combination of skill sets and equipment to make any city fighting very nasty indeed. One can only describe their devotion to duty as fanatical. To fight under the sight of their hero was the supreme honour, and to fail would shame their families up and down the generations. The largest block of troops consisted of the JSSDF soldiers tasked with the specific duty of protecting Tokyo Free. Many of them had still to be issued bolt rifles, but in his did serve them well by equipping them with new flat plate armour formed from the composite metal ceramic that served as Trident and Evangelion armour. The dedication couldn't be any less in defending their very own homes. Large trucks and small field guns formed a partition. Beyond that were gathered the psychic adepts and warrior monks of Javal, clad in white robes and silvery powered armour. Their swords, lances and glaives sparked with furious energy. The loss of their warriors inside the cradle was a revelation of how much their martial traditions had atrophied from their long, peaceful isolation. Combining ancient knowledge with new technologies might be difficult, but they needed to learn, to become truly worthy once more. There were 2 squads, of 8 custodes each and a sergeant. The Legio Terminatus were the empathetic point to end an argument. Their armour cost more than some battle tanks. Their contract is set to half a year pay per week. It seemed such a waste to just have them stand around as guards, but none of them made any complaint, nor wondered how their employer could even get his hands on the powered suits in the first place. It's a carry, hombres. It doesn't matter how. It's what he fucking does. It was still undecided which was actually scarier, those who could rip your forts open, or those who could pulp you with their little fingers. It was puzzling why the boy held absolutely no fear that they would betray him. After getting through a short ceremonial preamble, a tall figure in a blue business suit went over to a podium and addressed the gathered defenders. My name is Yang Wen Li. Some of you may know me. I'm not much good with speeches, so I'll get to the point. A small muttering passed through the Chinese and Russian troops. Young Ikari and Yang, 2 of among the most shameless gamblers upon the great game, playing together? Oh, this was going to get insane. It's been a hard few days. It's hard enough to rebuild after an attack of this magnitude, but doing so while trying to maintain quarantine and practicing new force deployments. You all performed superbly. Now that the quarantine is lifted, people can now leave, or come in. We can now hand the task of maintaining public order to civilian authorities and concentrate upon improving our own capabilities. As the official representative of the United Nations, let me offer my thanks and admiration. He looked over to the ranks of psychics. Tokyo 3 had its own secret police, but Nerve Section 2 was already overstretched with intelligence work and securing the safety of the pilots. The main problem with psychics is that, while they may always know if you were lying, there was no way to really know if they were telling you the truth. It was natural to mistrust what cannot be understood. However, humanity needed to unite instead of furthering even more division. And I'm sorry to say your efforts end here. The Hakone PDF is still a part of the JSSDF, and by the decision of the United Nations of the world, it must disband. Yang waited for a response, but silence only stretched out. There was no fear nor any doubt in the faces of those nearby. Yang sighed. Really? No emotional reaction at all? You suck! Kensuke shouted from his place on the platform, his fist raised in the air, cold and impatient at being woken up so early on a Sunday. Yang sighed again. He should have known better to try. He was just unsuitable for public speaking, unable to muster up the necessary gravitas no matter how much he tried. He resisted the urge to pick at his nose. Alright, I suppose it is a poor trick, since billions are already invested into this place. Lux in response said, "You've obviously got a plan, dumbass. Get on with it." His own thought was, "This place is a bad influence for even me." He chuckled a little into the microphone. It was a distinctly sinister chuckle. "I haven't felt this way in more than 10 years. Belatedly, those listening remembered. Nobody ever liked Yang's plans. They were always so baffling, sometimes even suicidal at the start. It wasn't as if there was a lack of competent and more ruthless opponents on the other side. For the first time, however, he felt lost. There was nothing in history that even resembled what was unfolding before his eyes. As before, he considered himself historian first, admiral second, hero last of all. He was one who didn't put stock in the great man theory of historical flow, but in cause and effect and what needed to be done. And frankly, his knowledge of history was just ridiculous. The mind that could keep track of interconnected events and people over thousands of years, calling them forth in an instant, found the task of coordinating the massive movements of men and war machines simple in comparison. And now, nothing. His mind was blank. He looked up and grinned. The best plan in the end is no plan. Beyond skill, beyond technique, there is pure, overwhelming might. That is something the enemy knows well. What you suffered just now was still the fruit of finesse. The next attack, none of us should hold back. If our enemies are angels, then we who stand below howl, holding the key to the gates of hell. A low "ooh" passed through the ranks. He's really fired up. Yang practically defined lazy-ass intellectual. So his enemies at the mainland realised early on that any hint of enthusiasm meant the approach of the critical moment, just shortly before they would be totally crushed in some unforeseen and totally humiliating manner. Oh shit, this isn't going to end well. Kensuke, off to one side, rubbed his hairless chin. Much better. See? Similes and metaphors work, he whispered aside. Colonel Nasuno still commands you. Your orders still come down from the generals of the JSSDF. However, the PDF is no longer enough. You defend more than a mere prefecture, more than a city. I won't be commanding anyone into battle, even though I won't be of any use anymore. But right here, we're going to have to discover a whole new way of raging war. Mostly because the old way was nuke spam. Yang's voice softened, shifting into his professor mode. Speaking to inspire, to blatantly manipulate emotions of many people, he found that very hard to manage. However, that calm flow of careful rationality might be even more chilling. There was always a reason behind every move, even if only to mislead the enemy. It was much easier to trust in the unknown plan, that there would be no meaningless waste of lives just to salvage pride. That was the cold, goal-oriented, event-driven calculation of a master strategist. The Hakone First PDF is organized according to UN Cooperative Command in land, sea, and air. However, as we just learned, the enemy is us. As you know, of all those arriving from abroad, there's a distinction. Psychics are those with certain talents, but psychers are those who have trained those into useless levels. Each squad must now have an attached psyker to protect and detect angel infections. There was some discomfort at this idea. To better respond to threats from within, the basic squad is now composed of 12 soldiers with a sergeant. With the psyker, this brings the squad composition to 14, which is conveniently the carrying capacity of the new Chimera personal carriers we just received. Heavy bolters, from heavy bolters to flamers, are now standard equipment. Each squad must carry at least 5 weapons known to reliably kill non-human enemies. This was something the troops were expecting, actually. Weight of fire would be useful, given as they were operating the close supply lines anyway. The only hitch was that it would break up all old organisations, forcing troops from different countries into self-contained fighting units. If they couldn't get along, they might as well be committing suicide. which was, perhaps, the entire point. The old question of quality versus quantity is really such an oversimplification. There's a much more viable issue of standardization. That's why our three nations have agreed to stamp out identical patterns of bolt rifles, hard flak armor, and the Chimera chassis. Yang paused and scratched his nose. By the way, the last battle showed how very quickly bolt armor can be burned through in burst mode. The 75 caliber bolt round is a bit overkill for unarmored enemies, and sometimes even overpenetrates. So, your new bolt rifles use the half-inch bolt round, the same used in bolt pistols. Prevailing theory is that pumping 3 rounds rapid into an enemy should kill it as thoroughly as the larger bolt anyway. He took a deep breath and cast his gaze around the field. But the point of this is not to mire you in mediocrity, or be reduced into a faceless tool for the accomplishment of an objective. To fight with the same weapons, to wear the same armor, to battle the same enemy. This is to give you the comfort of unity. Personal and national differences don't matter. We here should fight as one, as the last line of defense for the human race. In the end, we're all just human beings. We bleed red, and we hope to survive. Everything here, from the vulnerable Magnus Tancred, Yang pointed up, to the humble Hellhound, then to the row of modified chimeras, is devoted to the single absolute duty of saving the human race from extinction. The Evangelions might be powerful, but nonetheless have a glaring weakness. They cannot fight by themselves, without power, without technicians, without pilots. Those war machines are nothing more than useless lumps of heavy metal. A ground-level attack is the only thing Evangelions can't defend against, and therefore remains the surest threat. The civilians are worse than helpless. They may be turned to the enemy's purpose painfully and against their will. Now that the psychics all over the world are being sent here, more than ever we must be worthy of the faith that we can protect all of them. You are no longer just a PDF. Your duty is more than the protection of a single prefecture, but instead to guard the very hope of humanity. Recruitment and reinforcement are already on the way. This war is about to get worse, people, but that's why you're called the UN Improvisational Guards Regiment. Whatever it takes, you must hold. There's no one else, just you. Air, land, and sea, combined under one command, directed to one goal. This is to be known as the singular responsibility of the 101st Cerberus Regiment. This was surprisingly well received. Those who might have lost nerve had already left. Those who remained, whether out of duty or revenge, only asked for the proper tools. They would do the rest. If necessary, they would follow the angels to their heavens and slay them there. Yang turned around and got a sly look. Perhaps our honoured guest would like to say a few words. He stepped back and held out his hand towards the empty podium. Shinji winced but nodded. After fiddling with the microphone a bit, to lower it to its height, he began to speak. You will die here, he said flatly. In the end you are just men, flesh and blood, and our enemy spits upon the face of all reason. You are dead men and women. You must learn to accept that. Murmurs began to rise. This sort of speech was not what they were expecting. There were various dramatic tricks they were familiar with, but those were bold and uncompromising statements. After welcoming and working together with the boy, what was with the contempt and fatalism? I will be returning to Nerve tomorrow, and once there I'll have to trust in you that you'll be able to hold fast through whatever tricks the great enemy may pull. And I'm warning you now, to think that the angels are nothing more than dumb beasts is the greatest mistake any of us can make. This is your last chance. Leave. Run. For to stay here will be to expose yourself to unimaginable horrors and inhuman violence. The whole world will look at you as barely less terrible than the very monsters you fight. Go away, and for a while longer you might live out in peace and blissful ignorance. Reverse delivery? Maybe a dash of irony. The boy seemed to mean it too. Some of them supposed they should be insulted, but it only steeled their resolve to stay. Maybe it was true. They would die. That was why it was better they stayed. At least their deaths would have a point. Without that final line of defence, everyone everywhere would die anyway. For all that they recognised it, it was intriguing that reverse psychology still works. You are dead! Sooner or later, it will happen. If you put your own existence ahead of the human race, when that final battle comes, the enemy can and will take advantage of that. Your fears and your hopes and your human vulnerabilities. The enemy will batter at every point in our defences, both material and immaterial. In the end, only your unity and purpose can save you. And that is to accept your own mortality and push on. Innocence will depend on you. Are your lives worth more than theirs? This is more than your duty. This is your own choice. Stay and die. Leave and survive. You can't hope things won't be so bad. This is the war beyond all wars, stronger and smarter with every new form. The angels want to crush all resistance in their path, such is their contempt for humanity. What stands in their way is not the power of the Evangelions, but humanity. In the end, it all comes down to it, our weak selves against their vast might. Are we going to simply lie down and die because they want it so? Are we going to cower in fear from all the vile tricks they may use against the helpless and the innocent? Are you afraid of death? Are you afraid of mutation? Can you be stopped from doing your duty? Shouts roughly equivalent to, "Oh, hell no," went forth. You are the soldiers of mankind. You are the guardians who stand at the gates of hell. The dead howl for vengeance, and you must become as the spirit of wrath. You shall eat war and shit awesome! Shinji Kari leaned forward and slammed his palms down on the podium. You are Death Watch! Kill teams! You are the ones that make the Xenos die! The cheers were deafening, helped in part by Magnos Tancred spinning its Megabolter Gatling. Claps and shouts rose as the holographic banner atop the war machine switched to the new regimental standard. A large skull with a red, three-headed wolf behind it. 101st Cerberus Imperial Guards Death Watch. Shinji took off the gold laurels and let out a heavy sigh. He shivered, and his stance loosened out considerably. Once more, it was so strangely apparent just how completely unimpressive he looked. Why would people ever overlook that? Yang frowned. Now why is it that if I try to say things like that, people will start reaching for the launch buttons? He asked, sounding somewhat sulking. How can you keep a straight face while saying such ridiculous speeches, and yet somehow not end up looking silly? Yeah, sure you don't want a little pencil mustache, Harikari? Kensuke quipped. Shinji just shrugged. The difficulty is that people know you're sane, Yang-sensei. I don't have quite the same problem. That we entrust so much to you anyway, I find this both intriguing and appalling, the former admiral added, as they left the rough stage to let the base colonel get to work at actually reorganizing his troops. Yang mused, I wonder how long before they realize that the Order doesn't cover either the Adeptus Psychana or the Terminatus Legio, and start yelling at me about it. Well, as a rapid response force, a certain degree of independence is necessary. They're each a distinct UN entity, similar to NERV. Shinji frowned slightly. But you already know this. Yes, but when would politicians accept a simple reason as military efficiency when the thought of a power grab would do? I'm sure they'll find some other way of making trouble for the troops. Yang noticed that Colonel Nasuno seemed to have stopped in the middle of his speech and the more tedious aspects of actually assigning people to their new integrated squads. The soldier turned with dreadful slowness towards the group just leaving. He looked distinctly displeased. It seems the good colonel just realized it. He hurried the others off towards a racing jeep. Let's go! The door to his office opened with a hiss. Gendo looked up and smirked slightly. I knew you would return, he said. Shinji nodded slightly and crossed the room. In the end, none of us, not even Yang, could think quite like you, father. The boy smiled thinly. I need your help, and so I'm here. Will you obey? Yes, father, Shinji replied. I know why I must, at least." Gendo frowned. He had arranged things to ensure the boy would grow up spineless and suggestible. The aunt he had sent the boy to had always been resentful of how her sister was so blessed by the gods, so much smarter, more beautiful and more successful than she could ever be. Add to that the loss of her own son after impact, and the boy should never have been anything more than a burden. Where was the boy getting this confidence? Who trained him to stab through weaknesses in other people's emotional armour? Gendo had purged himself of human failings, as far as he was able to. He shouldn't have to fear his own son. Yet, the boy may have his face, but those eyes. Shinji had Yu's eyes, so accepting and so full of hope. In the determination to do whatever she thought was right, no one may stand in the way. He had warmed himself at the temple of her presence. He, personally, believed more in nurture than in nature. Yet for him, Yu was special above all, and for some reason he resented the thought of anyone inheriting her singular nature. However, if it could rise above the pressures he placed, then Yu, her qualities, could only be vindicated further. Mercy had never been one of Yu's virtues, though she gave plenty of rope to hang oneself. Perhaps part of why he loved her so was in finally seeing someone so much more ruthless than himself. It was a caring cruelty that she showed, never judging anyone good or evil, but only giving them what they deserved. If at first he had tried to use Yu, in the end he realised that there was also power in being used. The boy had apparently learned that lesson quite thoroughly. "You should know that I intend to initiate third impact." It failed to shock the boy. "I know, and yet nerve is still the best chance humanity has of avoiding extinction." "Not so. You are here because Nagisa's thoughts escape you." Gendo's eyeglasses flashed. "If you intend to avoid third impact, then you may as well go and join Nagisa. He will force us to attempt impact, leaving him as the only real faction interested in keeping this world as it is." That seemed to amuse him. "This broken world, with its declining population, is much easier to control." Father and son considered each other carefully. They were speaking with disarming honesty, in full knowledge that while in the end they may still be natural opponents in the great game, their short-term goals were similar. Only by helping each other could these be accomplished. The room seemed to ring with barely suppressed hostility. Gendo was such an immoral person, having sacrificed so many to reach his objective, that it was inconceivable to anyone else that he might have some selfless motive. He had reached the limits of human power already. It didn't seem too far a jump to believe he might want to be a god. Shinji could feel it. There were still many secrets about his father and Nerve that he didn't know. However, he consciously decided he didn't need to know. His motivation was simple: stop the extinction of mankind. Whether by impact or by killing off every human being on Earth one at a time, beyond the time when those scenarios would stop, he had no plans. "How much have you contaminated Ayanami?" was Gendo's concern. "Do I have to rebuild the scenario?" The boy's personality and activities may have been unforeseen, but Gendo hadn't really set aside the possibility that someone, just not his son, might attempt such things. "How can I protect them? They're needed most where they are." Shinji knew fear. He could feel his father's contempt at attachments, but it was still so worthwhile. It was still a weakness that Kaoru and Gendo would not hesitate to take advantage of. Shinji lowered his eyes, and Gendo smirked again at that token gesture of surrender. The boy, for all his talent, lacked true experience. At least he knew his limits. Too many fools wasted effort in futile defense of their egos and competence when a simple alternative was available. It was a war that didn't need Napoleons, or Hitlers, or even the Yang Wen-Li. Gendo fought back a chuckle. He knew this already from 15 years ago. How bleak, how lonely it was to stand at the top, but they who shared how it felt were naturally repulsed by each other. Yu Ikari was culpable of many things, and among it was not being there to give the two each a much-needed head slap. The boys returned to Nerve as greeted with subdued optimism. The staff worked a little faster, a bit more attentively, all trying to get the systems to smooth readiness. Finally, things could get done. At last, They were preparing to strike back. The sync test was underway. Ritsuko gasped as the readings came up. This can't be real. Maya! She motioned for her assistant to come closer. Tell me you're not seeing what I'm seeing. Oh my god! This is impossible! Shinji-kun, how can you get this sync level? Ritsuko nursed the migraine, an all too familiar sensation. That's it. Time to prescribe myself some medical marijuana. Senpai! Fine. You're just gonna have to stay here until we figure this out. You say that like it's a bad thing, Maya muttered. Then, in a louder voice, you can always count on my help, Senpai. Good, because when Asuka finds out, it's not going to be pretty. A few days later, Asuka Langley Soryu was found strangling Shinji Ikari near unto death. Rei Ayanami and Dr. Akagi nearby did nothing but watch.
What the fuck, Baka Shinji?
Asuka thumped his head off the floor.
You spent all that time building up our expectations and you still can't break your sync ratio over 30? You're doing it wrong!
Oh, really? Shinji shouted back, his voice uncommonly shrill. How could I have possibly failed to notice? Of course I know it's barely enough to get an Ava moving. I spent 3 months for the sake of recovering my piloting ability. And damn it all, I'm as much annoyed that all that effort seems wasted. I've tried meditation. I've tried mind-altering substances. Damn it all. Hit me again. Maybe that would shake a mental block loose. She obliged him. I was being sarcastic.
I know,
Asuka replied, and got off him. She rubbed her own forehead, as the situation also caused her headaches.
This is bullshit. You're useless. How can we get any of the new fighting formations if Unit 1's still impotent?
In the name of the Evangelion. Ouch, Asuka, Shinji said with a wince. That was entirely uncalled for. It's not that Pilot Ikari is incapable of performing Soryu. It is merely that he can provide only a tiny effort. Shinji began banging his own head on the floor. Apparently even Rei was somewhat annoyed. Logically, or rather according to story conventions, he should have broken through into new levels of competence. It made no sense. On the other hand, why should I really have expected things to work out as if this was a story? He looked dully up at the ceiling. I don't get it. It should have worked. Asuka turned towards Ritsuko.
Is there any chance it just some malfunction in the testing equipment?
The scientist shook her head. Unfortunately, no. It's reading his gradual increase in sync ratio just fine. We started out with the low 20s, and now he can hold sync at 30. This is completely unfair, Shinji added, numb. Narrative causality doesn't work that way. Yes, well, unfortunately, this is life, and it's inherently unfair, Ritsuko responded with some gleeful spite. Still, given that you left with barely 1% synchronization level, getting to 30% still counts as a massive improvement. Shinji got up and frowned down at the material of his plug suit. Listlessly, he made his way over to the door. I need to go think, he said over his shoulder.
Great! Now he's off to brood somewhere,
Asuka said with a huff once he'd left.
Well, as team leader, I have to say, it's less of a risk to make do with 2 Evangelions than to have a third that can actually fight.
She turned to Rei.
Still, 30%. It's enough to get an Ava moving, but not much else. It doesn't take much effort to pull a trigger, right?
Rei nodded. I may relinquish my fire support duties to fight by your side, Soryu. However, this does not recover our original team balance. I believe the situation will continue to be unacceptable to many parties. Maya leaned back on her chair and sighed. This is all so wrong. I don't want to blame Shinji-kun for this. She caressed the control panel and sighed. We need to fix this, and fast. The news spread quickly. Nerve personnel were disappointed, but nonetheless conceded that it was better than nothing. It wasn't good to expect too much. The only other way they could have received the news was, after all, in gibbering terror. They avoid meeting the boy's eyes as he walked through the halls with a mighty frown on his face. Confusion and aimless rage seemed to boil off his back. Shinji Ikari went to the gantry directly in front of Unit 1's cage and stared up at its monstrous face. It was the same place he'd first confronted his father and made his choice to fight. To kill. Things have gone full circle, he thought. We fought well that first time, our unprecedented sync ratio. I made you part of myself. Together we became the hope and fury of mankind. Shinji grabbed the handrails tightly and snarled up at that face. Why are you rejecting me now? He shouted. After I've sacrificed so much, after all the crap I've gone through? The monks had no answers. They were even more stunned by the news. They were useless. He couldn't even work up the indignation to kick their asses for breach of agreement. Shinji Ikari, he who can bend the world's strongest nations to his will. Bullshit. World's greatest errand boy, more like. The world was so full of fear, and the only one that many otherwise devious and powerful persons could even trust to mediate was someone who had absolutely no interest in their decaying forms of power. The Evangelion. The God Machine. It was the supreme symbol of mankind's will to live. The boy who could make that terrible power dance. Shinji Ikari stood there, absolutely motionless, for at least an hour. The cages were a high security area, for despite the coolant bath designed to reduce the chance of the Evangelions ever activating on their own, there was still a chance. It happened once before, the day Shinji Ikari arrived in Tokyo 3. Cages. The Evangelions were terrible monsters, so dangerous that when not being used they had to be frozen almost unto death. Makoto Hyuga worked for NERV, but even he saw that little illogic in it. If the pilots were needed for the Evangelions to even function, then all this was unnecessary. Ever since Shinji Ikari arrived in Tokyo 3, not once, not even once, had the Evangelions run rampant in any of their missions. The feverish propaganda about the Evangelions being unreliable so early on seemed so foolish now. Even Trident was the Evangelions' most ardent supporter. Why should mankind fear the Evangelion? The NERV officer thought as he finally dared to show himself. Why should the world fear the one who could master these monsters? He coughed politely. Ikari-kun! Ah, Hyuga-senpai. Hello. There were no tears, no lines of hate on Shinji's face. Just a deep, abiding confusion. The Evangelion was just too big, too inhuman for him to puzzle out. Even the Gisa at his most self-satisfied mood was understandable on some level. But the Evangelion, in that brief instant when he managed to truly connect, he could feel its contempt, as if the being had finally discovered humour, and it was laughing at him. The blood and the pain that they once shared were no longer enough to sate its hunger. Shinji pulled his consciousness back and smiled slightly. Makoto winced at the clear look of betrayal on the boy's face. Are you all right? He asked the boy. He turned to look up at the Evangelion and felt a thread of fear. No matter how much the press expanded his virtues just to keep the world from destroying itself in panic, face to face, there was something unnatural in it that spoke to the soul. Enemy, it will destroy you. Well, I hope you're not sick of unwanted advice by now. I can't say I know anything that could help with this thing. Makoto made an exaggeratedly casual shrug. But I don't think you should be blaming yourself too much for this. Shinji laughed weakly. Yeah, we're only human after all. He blinked and laughed at the Eva. And it's a wonderful feeling, he shouted up at it. When I cry, I want the wolves to howl. When I smile, I want the sun in the room. Makoto stood there, his own confusion and deficiencies also being rubbed raw. Where does it come from? How can someone so small be so strong? Is it natural, this force of personality? Can I have it too? I want to stop living in fear. I want to be able to walk into chaos and have the winds just flow around me. The lieutenant sighed and leaned on the railings. Sometimes I wish I was inhuman. Then I wouldn't have all the human faults and all the human problems. Then you'd just have inhuman problems, the boy replied, surprised. Makoto pushed up his glasses and smiled. Yes, our flaws help make us who we are, right? Shinji Kari grinned. These human problems. He looked up quizzically. Why is it always funnier when it's happening to someone else? Yes, and then there are some idiots that wish they were in your situation. Makoto tried not to nod too eagerly. And hey, you can have too much of a good thing, right? The boy looked puzzled. Well, yes. But in the end, though they had a lengthy and satisfying conversation, Makoto Hyuga was never really able to segue into the question he really, really wanted to ask. Coward! He shouted to himself. Maybe that's your problem, you stinking coward. So what if it's actually totally embarrassing to ask for love advice from a boy 10 years your junior? He began to hit his head on the metal railings. What an odd person, Shinji said to himself as he was leaving. I guess I just forgot how many strange personalities find themselves gravitating towards Nerve. Her small satisfaction at seeing the boy unable to perform any more blatantly unreal feats despite no lack of trying was quickly buried by the expectations that Ritsuko Akagi would figure it out eventually. The scientist stared at the eyeless, worm-like living sample of the mindworm, Annelid mentis inficio igum, and hissed at it. The thing hissed back, somehow sensing her presence despite having no eyes and being sealed behind 5 inches of armor plastic.
I feel much better if you didn't keep that sample here in your own lab, Senpai,
Maya said softly.
It's very creepy. It's evil.
It's a thing, Maya. A bioengineered weapon. It doesn't have any sense of self enough to be considered either good or evil.
Ritsuko wearily slumped back on her chair.
I can't stop now. I have to think. I have to figure out a counter for these things. Then either the defense against the angel's teleportation. Then your Shinji-kun just has to add some more to my workload. Which one's most important, Which is most dangerous to leave unsolved? I can't do this all at the same time. I'm only human after all.
Maya had admired Ritsuko for her apparent strength and unflappable expertise. Their new closeness revealed a more vulnerable side, but that only increased the younger woman's respect. Ritsuko Akagi may fear she wasn't equal to her mother, and complain on and on about the betrayal of reason, but through her mind and body may strain, she wouldn't break. Ritsuko yawned and scratched her hair. It was already well past midnight, but truth be told, other than Gendo's occasional attentions, she had very little else that might occupy her time. Maya giggled.
Is that an Akogi?
Indeed, atop the blonde scientist's head is a single clump of hair flexed vertically. Literally, idiot hair, in refusing to be combed down no matter what. Also commonly associated with those who denied reality. Giving in to her impulses, the younger woman tried to smooth down the errant strand.
Maya?
Huh? Oh, yes, Senpai?
Maya frowned. The Akogi was being stubborn. No way. She refused to accept any connotation that her senpai may be a fool. Ritsuko didn't mind the attention, knowing full well Maya's touchy-feely quirks. Unlike her sex symbol like Masato, the mousy little assistant did so without any overtones. Voicing off certain tasks on Maya freed Ritsuko to devote her attention on more cerebral matters.
A third Evangelion is more useful to us.
She looked up slightly.
I still think it's psychosomatic somehow.
Well, we've done everything to help. I mean, if it's genetics that determine whether or not someone's compatible with the Eva, then how's emotional state that important? I just don't know what else could be done.
Ritsuko smirked.
If there's nothing wrong with him physically, and even the CAT scans prove that, then it's got to be a mental block. Are you sure he's done everything that could have helped? After all, he's just a teenager. It's a time of great frustrations.
Maya blinked.
Excuse me?
Nothing. I was just joking. Let's get back to work.
Oh, all right, Senpai.
After a few more minutes at her own desk, Maya stood up suddenly.
Oh, that's right!
She turned to Ritsuko and bowed.
Pardon me, Senpai, but may I leave early tonight? There's something I have to test.
She was already turning towards the door.
Maya?
Yes, Senpai?
You do realize he really is certifiably insane, right?
She simply shrugged.
Yes? I guess it's not really that much of a problem for me.
Ritsuko waved it aside.
Very well. All right. I suppose I have been monopolizing you too much. Go do whatever you feel you must do.
Thank you, Senpai.
The younger woman all but fled. Ritsuko chuckled.
So she's still a young woman, despite all her maternal tendencies.
She put on her glasses and turned back to the screen.
It's better this way, she said to herself. Maya's too innocent for this sort of thing. My secrets are poison. No more lives should be ruined the same as mine.
She faced the mind worm and smiled maliciously.
Now, you little beast, it's time to see if the Evangelions are compatible with your cells.
Dinner at the Katsuragi apartment was a tense affair. Ray had moved out, though just where was a mystery. At least it was not to her old, dingy place. They had checked. The force of normalcy reasserted itself, and it seemed as if Shinji Ikari had never left. It helped that both he and Ray had rather Spartan tastes. This similarity did not extend to food, however, to Asuka's delight. Finally, real food! Unfortunately, this seemed to have occurred to others. Not a day passed without anyone else crowding the dinner table. That is, until that day. Ray, Maya, Ritsuko, and everyone else tangentially attracted to their little clique were conspicuously absent. What was annoying only turned out to be uncomfortable when it stopped.
I can't take this anymore,
she shouted and pointed at Shinji.
Enough with the brooding, emo boy. It's like you're liable to just snap at any moment.
Masato blinked, confused.
Asuka, maybe you shouldn't assume people would do the same things you would.
The red-haired girl twitched. Why did people assume she'd go berserk if anyone ever surpassed her sync ratio? It was just that the people around her were too damn meek and accepting of their circumstances.
So you're a little slow. So what? Move on already, damn it. Rise above your situation.
Shinji gave back a bland look. Well, that's easy to say, but I just don't know what to do. The getting out to the practice sessions is a little too slow. We might not have the weeks needed if the rate of improvement remains the same. Masato smirked.
Maybe you need to do something shocking to clear your head.
Masato-san, after all the weird and meaningless things I've already gone through, I doubt anything can shock me into a new mindset. Bam! Bam! Crack! The door to the Katsuragi apartment was kicked open. What the hell? Masato shouted, already reaching for the nearby drawer where she kept her gun. Then she remembered it was locked, for safety's sake considering there were teenagers in the place. Crap! She reached to throw a plate at the intruders. She put down the sukiyaki.
Okay, now what's this about?
There outside was Maya Ibuki, still in her nerve uniform. She was breathing heavily, but had a particularly determined expression.
Oh, sorry for interrupting, Masato-senpai. We just have a new treatment plan.
She gestured towards Shinji.
Seat him! Now!
Ray and Mana entered and forced the boy to the floor. Confused and curious, he didn't offer any resistance, until they handcuffed him with his arms behind his back. Hey!
What's going on?
Asuka asked.
It occurred to me that we haven't exactly tried everything in getting rid of whatever lingering stress or emotional security he may have. Don't worry, we asked the meditation tutors over at the temple. It might work. It's a legitimate procedure.
The boy's eyes widened with fear.
So you mean...
Those up at the temple were tantric Buddhists.
Yes, we haven't tried sex,
Mai replied tonelessly.
Maybe even with multiple partners. Perhaps even simultaneously. And repeatedly.
You can't be serious! Shinji and Asuka yelled together. No way! That's insane! Ray took out a device. Do not make me use this on you, Pilot Ikari.
Is that a ball gag?
Gasped Asuka. Help! Shinji begged of his roommates. Asuka considered how it was 3 against 1, and found that such odds didn't intimidate her at all. She began to rise from her seats.
Bring her too,
Maya said offhand, pointing to Asuka. The girl fell back on her chair and tumbled to the floor.
Oh no you don't! Stay away from me, you crazy deviants! Masato, do something!
Help! Masato took another swig of her beer. Maya was acting too serious. Too overblown dramatic. Then the younger woman winked playfully. Masato chuckled. Fine, she could play along. The boy was just taking everything all too seriously.
Okay, just bring them back tomorrow. They've got classes.
She touched her chin and made a thoughtful pose.
I don't suppose. No, a fivesome's enough for now. Go on, have fun.
Masato, you wretched excuse for
Asuka slumped forward, unconscious. Mana was blushing so much her face looked like it would explode, but followed orders anyway. Technically, Mayabuki was not her superior officer, but... She turned towards Shinji and held up the crackling taser. She wouldn't hesitate to use him on him too. Please tell me you were messing with the recipe again and this is just another hallucinatory episode? Shinji asked plaintively of his guardian.
Nope, sorry,
she replied, grinning. She waved.
Toodles, Shinji-kun.
Should I really fight this? The boy thought. Damn it, this isn't part of my scenarios. I should try. For the sake of my principles anyway. No, it would be demeaning for them to go this far just for the sake of getting me to function for the Ava. He placed all women in his life on such a high pedestal, so much that he refused to entertain any thought or tolerate any insult against their character. They weren't sluts, they were nobody's bitches, and he couldn't treat them that way. Masato! Mana tasered him before he could indulge in any more internal conflict.
Oh, thanks, Masato-senpai.
Maya and the girls bowed.
Now, off we go to hot immorality, or therapeutic destruction, or planning how to collapse the world's nations and form a unified Terran Empire and its space navy.
The nerve lieutenant pointed grandly outside.
Onwards, my sisters!
Masato watched them leave. There was already a chimera waiting downstairs. She chuckled and went back inside, putting the incident out of her mind. A few hours later, several buildings collapsed for no readily apparent reason. The warriors of the Adeptus Psychana were sent out to quell some vague disturbance. Then the Turbinatus Legio, all 36 of them, had to deploy. Dogs howled, birds screeched, a fearful and superstitious lot cowered in their highways, and various other portents of doom spread through the night. Masato Katsuragi slept soundly. Morning. The door to the Katsuragi apartment was fixed, due to an overnight job by helpful Section 2 personnel, and their flunkies. The door slid open. Uncharacteristically, Masato was already awake. She was grinning as Shinji and Asuka wearily entered the apartment. Their clothes were dishevelled, their hair matted by sweat and cement, and their faces were dull with fatigue. They had linked arms, supporting each other's weight to stand.
So, did you two have fun?
Fuck thee, Masato. Fuck thee. Why, evil, evil woman. You could have stopped all that crazy shit from ever happening,
Asuka replied hoarsely.
Live your perverted fantasies vicariously somewhere else.
Oh, come on.
Masato turned to Shinji.
It was for your own good. So, what happened?
Nothing happened. Ever. It was exhausting, it was random, it was completely pointless, and you're never going to know.
Yes, that's right. Nothing happened. It's permanently erased from memory. It's not canon. It never happened. Once again, Masato, let me express my utter hate for you.
Oh, you guys are no fun.
No, Masato-san. Fun should be something that happens to other people. Both teens trudged towards their respective rooms. They were so tired, their minds were willing to accept anything, any form of convoluted logic, as long as it would just shut up. They collapsed face first into their beds and were instantly asleep. A while later, the alarms began to sound. The angels were finally attacking again, ending the sweet and fragile peace. Masato rushed into the pilot's rooms to rake them up.
Tell it to come back tomorrow, would you?
Asuka mumbled through her pillows.
I'm not in the mood for its shit.
Asuka!
Fine.
Asuka removed the pillow off her face and glared at Masato with bloodshot eyes. She was still too sleepy to think sensibly.
But this is all still your fault. You had a shot at a rational universe, and you blew it.
Nerve Battle Command slid into easy practice readiness. The pilots were suited up and sent into their respective war machines. In contrast to Shinji and Asuka's raw, fatigued look, Rei and Mana looked awake and alert. Maya too seemed a bit too cheerful about facing the enemy again. Masato sat in a chair and looked back at the commander's station. Gendo and Fuyutsuki were there. "You may have battlefield control of Nerve now, Colonel Katsuragi," she was told.
All right, status check on the civilians?
"All in their shelters. See the defense groups on standby," Makoto reported.
What do we have on the Angel?
The main screen showed a blurry satellite view. There was a roundish blob at the centre of vague blueness.
Hey, can we get a better picture?
"Sorry, Katsuragi-san. It's a local effect of the Angel's AT field. That really is how it looks, at least from far off. We haven't risked any close flybys of recon craft."
Leave that to the JSSDF for their missile cameras.
She swiveled her chair around towards Ritsuko Station. She blinked.
Is that a hoagie?
Misato blinked again. She decided to ignore it for the moment.
How are the pilots?
She inquired instead. Ritsuko pushed up her glasses and read off a clipboard.
No activation problems. How are their sync ratios now, Maya? Rada's current holding at low 80s. Shinji is at 43%.
Misato looked impressed.
That's much better than before. Still not enough to use the AT field, but...
"Do you intend to send Pilot Akari out to combat Katsuragi?"
No. Evangelion Unit 1 should remain in reserve here at the Geofront. The inherent AT field inefficiency caused by a low sync ratio can be compensated by direct access to our banks of power capacitors. We can afford, or we might as well, waste power if the Angels do manage to break through into the Geofront. Never happen,
Asuka put into the open channel.
Don't worry, we'll beat it.
"Overconfidence is a weakness, Soryu. Remember that." Gendo deigned to scold the girl. "Carry on, Colonel. We still require intelligence about the Angel." It came from the sea. Since the nigh-on destruction of the UN Pacific Fleet, sea-borne assets were wary about engaging Angels. At least with land assaults, there was a possibility of cover or timely interception by the Evangelions. At sea, vessels were limited to 2 dimensions and well aware of their extreme vulnerability. Even the Hakone docks relied on land-based guns for primary defence. The accepted doctrine was to spam Angels from afar with long-range strikes, preferably nuclear in nature. At least hitting it while still at sea reduced radiation contamination. There was still the little thing that Japan lacked: nukes, however. By the time the detectors picked it up, the Angel Lelo was already less than an hour away. Strikes from China and Russia would arrive too late, hitting it over land. Naturally, Nerve and Tokyo 3 declined the favour of irradiating themselves and their farmlands. There were several emplaced guns set into the hills, positron, laser, and conventional huge caliber cannons. The JSSDF took the opening salvo, leading off with several N2 tipped missiles, and then all the land guns in succession. The hills prevented the Ashino Lake Cannon from joining in. No AT field barrier was detected, yet every shot inexplicably missed. Though the 2 warships stationed at the local dock were purchased fairly, the crew were on loan from the UN. The captain of the particle gun cruiser Kringlith was a relatively young man for his responsibilities, whose last assignment was XO for one of the doomed refit battleships. That disastrous battle against Gagio was his first taste of real combat, and every single person in his crew had a definite grudge against all the Angels. He turned towards the ship's resident psyker. "Well, what can you sense?" The attendant psyker was a telepath of the Filhos de Santo Cristo. The Catholic Church, ironically despite its bloody reputation against witchcraft, also over the centuries held and hid within its more obscure ranks some of the most talented seers. He was clad in a white cassock and stared out towards the horizon. Temperature inside the bridge dropped perceptibly. He staggered. 1,000 minds. Buzzing. Clawing. Captain, more than just distorting your radar. It seems to be projecting an illusion. Everyone still felt uneasy being around those with weird abilities. "The most important thing is, can you people break through?" the captain asked archly. "Can we hit it?" The clergyman bit back an insulting retort. They were so important to the task, yet still the focus of so much disrespect and fear. He would forgive it for a while longer. Yes, Captain. I believe we can. He had his own problems with dealing with heathen assembly of other psychics on board. As the Angel moved closer, the gun cruiser Kringlith set out to add its own firepower into the fray. It moved parallel to the shoreline at flank speed, but each shot unerringly homed in towards the enemy. Since the ship used superconductors and special capacitors, its rate of fire and power output was superior to that of the emplaced guns. Heaven-bore cannons were more of a pulse stream of charged particles instead of large space blast. The Angel raised the barrier, deflecting the attacks. The ship hit it again and again, until the sensors were starting to short out from all the loose electromagnetic chaos in the air. Then, inexplicably, the cruiser stopped. There was a shriek, then a loud wrenching noise, and the ship seemed to shrink into itself. The captain was thrown aside and off his chair. For a moment he cursed. How cliché it was to be tossed around in a ship's bridge. Yet he felt no need to belt in. It was just the initial probing phase of the attack, and while standing he wanted to observe the hits. Conventional procedures. That's the mistake, he said to himself, and grit his teeth. "Status report," he shouted, while still on the floor. I'm fine, go! What's the damage? Casualties?" There was a large gaping hole clear through the ship's side. Fortunately, it was above the waterline. Even so, the shock of impact alone killed some of the crew. Many others were injured by shrapnel and assorted debris. The ship's reactors and guns were intact. It could still fight. Should I risk another salvo? The captain considered. "Father Marcello, are your people still capable?" The priest clutched at a wall pipe and closed his eyes. After a while he nodded. Yes. Captain, the great enemy was actually hurt by the last attack. I could feel pain and the death of lesser things. It's angry now." The captain nodded. "If we can weaken it before it gets onto shore, if we can force it to reveal its hand, then we've done something worthwhile." He turned to the comms officer. "Get a tight beam to Tokyo 3. Tell them exactly what happened. Let them figure out just what weapon the enemy's using. Then tell the crew to secure themselves." He sat in his chair and locked the seatbelts. For the sake of learning how to defeat the enemy, they were going to take another hit. "All guns! Fire!" There was another shriek, and a bone-jarring shock. The cruiser rolled in place, almost tipping over. The enemy's hit slammed into just below the bridge, punching through layers of heavy metal armour and out the other side. A splash drizzled seawater upon the deck. The ship was silenced. Its sister ship, the modified combat transport cruiser Carringdol, moved to assist. It lacked the powerful main guns, but made up for it in banks of secondary and anti-air cannons. Of course, the cargo space could be devoted for rescue equipment. The Kringlith was taking in water and gave no response to radio. The air screamed again, and the incoming modified ship pitched as if sucker-punched. It continued to drift until it collided with the other cruiser. Back at the command centres, those watching gaped in disbelief. "What just happened?" Masato asked. "The damage. It appears consistent with that of a high-velocity impact, Katsuragi-san," Makoto reported. A screen zoomed into the ships. "Lasers should normally be invisible, but then again, shouldn't leave a sonic boom, and there were no signs of melting, just torn metal." "Survivors?" "We're getting situation reports now. There are some, but they're now trying to keep the ships afloat." "Wait one..." The screen showed the ships jerk visibly. "The Angel's really pounding on them. They won't last long at this rate." Masato leaned forward and snarled in pain. The Angel denied those brave souls a clean death, but instead subjected them to that torture. It was undeniably malicious. Whether or not the Angel was smart enough to know ships weren't really alive, there was a savage abandon in ripping the cruisers into jagged shreds. Layla was close enough to provide a visual scan. It was an orange striped sphere, roughly 600 metres across, floating in air. It was wrapped in cloudy mist. Then, as the monitoring situations resolved the image, it turned out that the clouds were clumps of flying things, bug-like but without wings. "Air power! Shit!" Masato muttered. Somehow she had a feeling those things were ready to kamikaze. The Evangelions had proved they had extreme difficulty in handling small, agile enemies. And yet, those things were just big enough to overcome the defenders and their bolter fire. There was a swarm. There were clouds of the damn things. Katsuragi-san, a message from Cerberus base. At Masato's nod, Shigeru continued. It's not in your area yet. We do not release jurisdiction of this battlefield. We still have other means. Most of the defense around Tokyo 3 were massive-scale cannons, geared against similarly massive enemies. Only recently had they started to fortify against smaller ground-level threats. The enemy had unsportingly refused to attack from the ground. Trident Base was built with an airfield. As it was rechristened into Cerberus Base, it also received 16 more modified heavy fighter jet VTOL gunships. At the word, all rose into the air to meet the enemy. The enemy had thousands. They were 42, though more air assets were on the way from other airfields around the Kanto plain. But so what? Was their thought. We ride the Tempest! They shouted into comms as Afterburner kicked in. We bring the storm! Nose-mounted laser cannons, nicknamed the Bright Lance, flashed through the kilometres to rake at the enemy. The air seemed to crack open, and the gunships dodged wildly against something none of the pilots could see. There were no hits. Apparently, they too were small and fast enough to trouble the enemy's accuracy. Deep within the geofront, the Evangelions were waiting in grim expectations. It was the glory of their days. It was the terror of their moments. The HFJ VTOL were very manoeuvrable aircraft, capable of circling around the target or even reversing on a flip. Tiltable jet engines on the wingtips and vector thrust engines combined with punishing firepower had them comparable to a flying battleship. The addition of a laser cannon offset two inherent flaws: limited standoff ability and running out of ammunition. With these, even dedicated fighter jets had to be wary. No amount of thrust can outrun a light-speed weapon. And as for close-in dogfighting, the enemy bugs were tentatively named bomb scarabs as they exploded upon impact. They also seemed capable of spitting globs of acid, but not from too far away. One Tempest pattern jet VTOL plummeted, burning into the sea. The defenders' best bet was to destroy the enemy scarabs before they got close. The enemy were just too many. The aircraft could fill their bomb bays with other equipment, as the Bright Lance lasers were comparatively low-weight weapons. It took some fiddling around with the components, but there were 3 new, freely swinging bolt gun turrets. There was some discussion about smaller laser guns, as infinite repeaters to further accentuate ammo independence, but in the end it was decided the main gun had a rapid enough rate of fire to need all capacitors dedicated to it. Bolt guns would actually chew up an angel's hide from the inside, whereas large caliber solid rounds did little more than pinpricks. The air was filled with a harsh buzzing, broken by the staccato pattern of bolter fire and the piercing wail of laser cannons. The Tempest squadrons flew, dived, swooped and rolled. They fought and they died. They scoured the skies, flying in their practice spiral formations to deliver an unceasing rain of death. Those watching it from below were struck with both awe and grief, in full knowing it couldn't last. Technology evolves doctrine, Yang thought. Already the flies were feeling the pinch, forced to tighten their spiral into a dwindling loop. Flying close together allowed them to increase the volume of fire, but also damaged their essential manoeuvrability. The Tempest gunships had to break loose, thrusting up as like a tornado. Dorsal bolt guns slapped at pursuing enemy flyers. Jet engines were still faster and more responsive than whatever the hell means the bugs were using to fly. Then, disaster. So many of them that the bugs were bumping into each other. Sparks began to arc between their strange gleaming black shells, and they started to move faster. It was like a steady drip of milk upon a cup of black coffee being stirred. It was as if a many-hued serpent snapped at a rising column of contrails. First one, then another. The VTOLs were being snapped up in its jaws. With their noses pointed upwards, their belly bolt guns didn't have enough punch to keep it at bay. Finally, screaming, one of the Tempest gunships cut and reversed, the pilot and gunner almost blacking out from the G-forces. Its laser cannon pumped at the enemy's formation, scattering the snake's head. The bugs broke off into 2 tendrils that came together, crushing the plane and finishing it off with a fiery death. The Tempest broke off into separate directions at full burn, trying to extend how long they may delay the enemy. Of the 42 that set out, only 17 were left. They banked and flashed their readiness to go back to the fight. The bugs would do horrendous damage to the city. They mustn't let the fighting get to the streets. The enemy still had their uncountable swarms. The air defence missiles were refusing to lock on, and in any case the few shore batteries that could fire were given a poor showing against such a diffuse target selection. Then the skies lit up in fire. The Kringalith and the Carringdol, though pitted and covered with scars, still strained with their last ounce of worthy steel, anti-air guns and missiles, now that the enemy was finally in range. The bugs split their attention, some turning back to at least die of a purpose, slamming into and scorching against the ship's hulls. Laylo floated by, unconcerned by the drama of human lives stretched to the edge. It passed the shoreline, its shadow swallowing the docks. Ground-based guns continued to pound away at it, but to no effect. Its AT field was set to a full barrier mode, distorting the air around itself, and making everything appear like something out of a dream. Now and then, a gun roost would just crumple up into a heap of broken and useless machinery.
It's a hypervelocity projectile,
Ritzko decided.
I don't know how and from where in that globe the Angel is propelling it, but the end result is what matters here. Kinetic strikes are, for a given input of energy, more efficient than more exotic weapons.
Except for that it just doesn't work against the AT field,
Misato put in.
Yes, but for everything else.
The scientist gestured at the screen.
It's simple, it's effective, and it's a sign that the enemy may have some recognition of just how much more difficult mere human resistance could add to its task.
Asuka yawned before replying.
Not to mention it, if that actually hit the Ava, it would still really hurt. Countermeasures?
Misato asked Ritsuko. The scientist sniffed contemptuously.
Since it's less effective against the Evangelions, we can't assume that this is the Angel's primary weapon. We haven't tempted it into showing its true abilities.
Misato nibbled at her thumbnails as Laylo entered Hakone airspace. The Tempest Squadron, what was left of them, retreated towards Cerberus base. The multitude of guns around the base, most of them 20mm AA cannons, gave them a window for landing. However, all that the pilots wanted were more bolt ammunition. The sky above Tokyo 3 was starting to darken as the Scarabs circled around the city. Where was the Trident? It waited behind a row of buildings in the city proper. It was ready to provide covering fire for the Evangelions while they emerged from underground.
The Trident doesn't have an AT field. It's still vulnerable to the attack,
Asuka said offhand.
Think we should pull it back? Excuse me?
Mana tugged at her peaked black hat and sneered.
Magnos Tancred was made to soak up damage. If the Angel's dangerous, then it makes no sense to hold us back just in case we take damage. Now's when you need us most, Langley Soryu. Yeah, well, I noticed that the Trident's in brawler configuration, Kirishima. What can you do against an Angel that's off the ground?
Trading fire of the Angel's pointless anyway,
said Misato.
There's no time to refit the Trident for Hellfire configuration. At least this way it can use the buildings for cover.
She stared up at the Angel's deceptively sedate approach.
The Angel definitely knows how to use cover too. It's keeping away from the Ashino cannon's firing arc.
The artificial island upon the lake was also under attack, but the location was appropriately hardened. Overlapping kill zones from its own defence guns and those in the hills around it were sufficient to keep the scabs from forming into large enough swarms. Power spike! Makoto shouted suddenly. The Angel's increasing the strength of its AT field!
Here we go,
whispered Misato.
Cards down.
Laylo rose into the air, clearing the hillsides. The sky seemed to split open. A lance of blinding pink energy shot out from the anti-orbital cannon and punched clear through the Angel. At the same time, layers upon layers of armour and concrete were perforated. The sphere's fuzzy appearance began to degrade further. Some of the scabs around the Angel fell, like puppets with their strings cut.
We hurt it!
Maya gasped.
We really hurt it!
But not enough,
Misato replied grimly.
It's here.
Laylo slid into Hakone's sheltered flatlands. Its shadow oozed out from the hills and began to cover the outlying streets. Above, the scabs were forming into clumps and spiraled around the Angel like the clouds of a typhoon. Defenders on the ground were starting to realise the danger of self-guided flying bombs. The scabs traced strange geometric patterns in the sky. They swooped down in a line, and if the lead scab should be destroyed, there were still several more behind it. If one wasn't enough to break through a fortified bunker, then again and again and again the bugs would slam into the hatches, the sheer weight of their self-destructive numbers allowing them to break through. Some of the bomb scabs landed on the streets, unfolding spindly legs from their thoraxes. These began to spread out, inspecting streets seemingly at random.
They're searching for the entrances, Ritsuko hissed. It's a roundabout way in, but it should be faster than trying to blast or drill through into the geofront.
Still, she was puzzled. That didn't necessarily allow the much larger angel down. There was something else there that the angel wanted to do. In many ways, fighting the scabs was simpler. There was no hesitation, no moral qualms. They were the enemy and they had to die. The problem was that when they die, they explode. Shrapnel tore into the streets wherever they were engaged by ground defenders. The heavy Lehman Russ tanks were easy prey against enemies from the air. Intended to be mobile strongpoints, the tanks were forced to hold position near the shelters, where turrets may provide cover and they may add the weight of their sponsor-mounted bolter against bomb scabs that for some reason chose to just walk down the street. The infantry blessed their Chimera tanks. The APCs rushed through the streets, taking out whatever enemies in the way, but their destinations were selected buildings where the infantry could hole up and take pot shots at the enemy. Some of the structures, though serving as offices, had armoured walls and roofs. Too bad for the insurance companies, but once the scabs finally noticed and decided to take out the harassment, the improvisational guards just ran down to their Chimera to relocate, even as the floors above them started to immolate. Unlike other attacks, there were no civilian casualties. The shelters and defenders were doing well in keeping the angels out and the squishy populace in. It was terrifying, but it was also somewhat astonishing. It was, so far, a clean war. Through it all, Shinji Ikari remained silent. The Evangelion, with its paltry 40 sync ratio, felt cold and remote. The angel, he whispered to himself. Its attack was powerful and unrelenting, true, but it lacked the raw, calculating malice from the last time. It's pure. This angel isn't acting to Nagisa's will. It's here of its own volition. True, the angels had always been the great enemy, but to return to where it began, it made things so much simpler. He leaned back and sighed. For what did he endure all those tasks, and made his name so hateful to so many? They were dying out there. He could hear the frenzied communications. For this, he'd thrown away the powers mystical for the military, the philosophical for the practical. All for an Evangelion that couldn't appreciate the sacrifice. To kill the angels. To ensure the survival of humanity. He found that he couldn't hate the angels. The enemy were easy to understand, in their own way. Such animal loyalty, such beastly rage. But not evil. They could never be evil. But Nagisa, he who had sworn to the same purpose, kill the angels, ensure humanity's survival. It was the first time the Evangelions had failed to kill the enemy. Angels couldn't think like humans. Humans were extremely good at killing other humans. The scouts were still attacking anything that might look like a geofront entry gate. Many as the swarm may have been, it was still a finite number. Boom, boom, boom against the street-level elevators, but those were designed to collapse their tunnels if ever violently broken through. There were fake entrances too, designed to confuse the enemy. Unfortunately, the location of shelters were only slightly less prominent. The angels tended towards extreme specialization instead of combined arms. The scabs attacked whatever showed up as a threat, while Laylor's fuzzy globe hovered above, waiting for bigger prey. Captain Avrikopolis and his Heraclitus were the last line of defence for the shelters. The problem was that there were only 36 of them, and the city had no less than 20 different shelters. Now that Shinji Ikari had joined NERV, their contract also passed to them, for the first time giving the paramilitary organisation actual military force. They were sent to stand behind the armoured doors of Shelter 12B, the one for the families of high-ranking NERV personnel. Also there were the mayor, various journalists, and most importantly perhaps, the families of Suzuhara, Hiraki, and their very own. The shelter had the only back door leading into the geofront. Bam! Whomp! The secondary blast doors were starting to buckle. The mercenaries heard the distinctive chittering sound of the enemy, and then as the bulkheads bent out of shape, a hissing spray. Tactical dreadnought armour was crafted from the same materials Evangelion armour was made of. While they had little to fear from kinetic or thermal attacks from enemies of comparable size and weight, Acid was always something to beware. Those inside were told to keep the final seals closed no matter what. The line of defenders didn't flinch, even as the liquid started to trickle out into the chamber. In such cramped space, the enemy's weight of numbers were meaningless. They were mainly Greeks. They were ready to make it their Thermopylae. "Is this water?" the Heraclitus captain noted. For a moment he felt awe. Simple, harmless seawater. The enemy won their confrontation well before it even started. Seawater poured out of Lalel's shadow at a prodigious rate. It had a diameter of just under 800 metres and quickly flooded the streets. Chimeras were heavy enough not to float, but weren't watertight. Also suddenly, it seemed, the defenders were reduced from a polished tactical spread into little islands of resistance.
"Cancel the launch!"
Masato shouted.
"What the? Where is all that coming from?" "I should have noticed this sooner,"
Ritsuko hissed out angrily.
"The angel is an asphere, we see. That's just its three-dimensional shadow. The angel is there. For now, let me assume it's a space 680 meters in diameter, with a thickness of 3 nanometers. The ultra-thin space is supported by an inwardly directed AT field. The inside is an imaginary space, called a Sea of Dirac. A little testing should prove that hypothesis." "Imaginary space?" "The mathematics are sound, though."
Ritsuko stood up and pointed at the screen.
"That's what's strange. Dirac Sea is a theoretical model of the vacuum as an infinite sea of particles possessing negative energy. The AT field is altered space. As far as our scientific knowledge goes, a Dirac Sea could lead to an entirely different universe." "Really? How can we fight a whole universe?"
Masato replied, boggling.
"I knew the angels were getting bigger all the time, but... Whoa!"
Ritsuko just sighed.
"It's an angel, Masato. I wasn't being literal. There are 2 possibilities to answer your earlier question. The first is that it's releasing seawater it had collected as it approached. Or it can establish a direct gateway between 2 points like a tunnel. And that right there is trying to drown us using the entire Pacific Ocean."
God damn these angels and their AT fields.
Well, you have to admit, it's so simplistic that it's stupid. But when applied to a massive scale, the strategy does have a certain brute elegance,"
said Asuka.
"The T equipment aren't watertight, are they? How quickly can we refit for C-type equipment?"
"I don't think the waters will rise high enough to go above the Ava's knees, but that's still a disaster to everyone else."
"You must maintain the integrity of the geofront, Katsuragi," Gendo said from above. "We have no way of knowing what's in the waters." The woman grit her teeth but nodded. The burden of command was to know what and when to sacrifice. All the work with fortifications. And yet really, who would ever have thought to supply the city with lifeboats? They were in the mountains. There were pleasure craft at the lake which could have been useful, but no one could actually get there.
"The shelters are airtight. They should last until we can blast the channel to drain the flood, Katsuragi-san," Mana said softly. "But we can do something. Mom, requesting permission to engage in rescue efforts." "We need to kill the angel first, Kirishima."
"Then send us out,"
Asuka added. Masato nodded and pointed.
"Take the hillside exit, the one facing away from the angel. Units 0 and 2 prepare to launch."
She then looked at the purple face of Unit 1.
"Unit 1 to remain on standby."
Shinji nodded, his heart heavy. Understood. He'd done everything he could. It was a strange feeling to be unnecessary. All that time during his when he longed for rest, in the end he still feared that somewhere, somehow he'd left careless flaws. His plans, he had to see it through to the end, at the same time doubting if he could actually bear the sight of his failure. It's better this way. Now it's my turn to have faith. They won't fail. He looked on fondly as the girls surged into action. Boom! Captain Avrikopoulos rinsed as the pressure wave struck, and their careful lines toppled like 10 pins. Underwater, a nearby blast was no less dangerous than one took point blank. The bomb scabs had finally broken through, but the gap in the doors was still too small to let them in. Something flashed by and struck and flitted away, leaving behind a trail of bubbles. The Heraclitus laboured to react. Slow and ponderous in the first place, water multiplied their difficulty in movement. Muscles ached to force mechanical ones into motion. Thunder hammers and storm shields were useless. The assault cannons were too unwieldy to use even as clubs. The storm bolters, fortunately, the rounds were two-stage projectiles. The initial kick from chemical propellant was enough. It was hard to get a clear view at their new, fast-moving enemy, but wisps of purplish blood indicated they were still fleshy things. The Terminator armour was airtight, but more for NBC protection than underwater operation. They had enough air in an internal bottle to fight on for 30 minutes more. Given that the suits weighed 3/4 of a ton, they were unsure of being able to fight their way out and into an air pocket. They had very little hope the water level out on the streets was still below neck level. Their power, their valour, how so perfectly nullified. It was almost meaningless in such a closed space. The bomb scabs were exploding again outside, spurting jets of water into the darkened corridor. Something clung at his face and tried to chew through his helmet. It looked vaguely shrimp-like, with beady black eyes and long floating tendrils obscuring its mouth. Multiple limbs ending in serrated claws gripped around his body. It had a long, sharp nose horn similar to that of a swordfish. The thing looked like some sort of living spear. It was a futile effort. In actual contact, Terminator armour was still too strong and too tough. He punched himself in the face and there was a squishing noise. Pulped, bone-white alien carapace clung to his chest plate even after he pulled the thing off. He forced himself to breathe slower. All the enemy had to do was waste their effort, make them consume their precious air reserves even faster. They were the only thing standing between the enemy and their precious people. They knew the risks in coming to Tokyo free. The shrimp-like things were fast and attracted to light. They had already destroyed the wall lights, and even after being driven off would inevitably try to get at the Terminator's search lamps. Captain Akrivopoulos was struck from behind, hard enough to knock him off his feet. There were 3 of the things upon him, trying to chew and saw away at the more vulnerable segments of his armour. The irony was almost painful. He'd grown up a fisherman's son. He so loved to eat prawns, and in the end would be killed by them. He heard a strange grinding noise, and the spear prawns screeched and died. He felt himself being helped back to his feet. He saw a man-shaped figure in strange green armour. He, for the face mask was transparent, floated a bit off the floor. Though formed of hard plate, it seemed the suit was buoyant. The right hand was free to help or hold a spear gun, but the left ended in a slowly spinning bright yellow cone. Captain Avrikopoulos shone his light at the faceplate.
Sergeant de Leon,
He rumbled out.
I thank you for your assistance.
No problem. There's not much we do here. They say we've got to seal this entire section off with Bakelite. The former JSSDF, now UN Imperial Guards, soldier pointed out towards the gap. We'll try to hook you up to a chopper, sir. Follow us, please.
I wasn't aware we had a special unit for this situation.
Got me by surprise, too. I was expecting maybe a little fun time with the tanks, but Yang pulled my entire squad out for this a couple of weeks back. You're Heraclitus. The Marine saluted with his free hand before taking up his fletchet gun. Reporting. We are Death Watch. Kill Teams Tritonis.
I wonder how long before some fools decide to strap rockets onto their backs to become Fighting Force Icarus,
the captain rumbled back. The other man's approving grin was apparent. Despite the grim face of their suits, mercenaries were not totally humourless bastards. It felt good to be a protector again. The Terminators had little difficulty in pushing the blast doors open. More of the green-armoured Hydra suit soldiers were waiting at the other side. One of them approached, bouncing weightless in the chamber leading up to street-level hatches.
We've got more of the fucking shrimps coming this way. Ready to set off the flash bomb, boss?
On my mark, Takahashi. He turned to the Heraclitus captain and advised them to turn away for a bit. Though they were of different rank structures, they held the common respect of men in voluntary exile, doing their best for things they didn't quite understand. He set his own faceplate to opaque mode. Now! A bright flash and a tangible boom filled the water. Captain Avrikopoulos felt like laughing as he continued to listen into the radio channels. Again he was filled with awe. It was war, and war tended to favour the paranoid schizophrenic, even with all the risks, even with needing to abandon their own homes. How could anyone among them ever have doubted that it was so completely the right thing to do? How could any of them falter in the faith the boy actually had a plan for each of them? Where else could they find true safety, bought with their own power? A peculiar, independent yet self-sacrificing mindset was required for those trusted with new powered suits. Oftentimes this didn't translate to respect for the chain of command. It was the man, the boy had said, who makes the armour dangerous. They were each chosen. What sane planner would have expected having to fight submerged while in the mountains? It was impossible. Furthermore, can anyone really be expected to be proficient in new and unprecedented tactics in less than 2 weeks? What a waste of time, reason dictated. Pile on, boys! Show these scum who we are. Time to go kick reason to the curb and go beyond the impossible, Sergeant de Leon shouted. His squad triggered underwater jets to drive straight at the enemy. Their weapon-shorn left arms whined with deadly intent. Pierce the aliens with your drill! The hillsides opened up, and upon electromagnetically charged rails, the Evangelions arrived. First, Unit 2, then Unit 0. They got up from their lying position and waited for their weapons. Ritsuko Akagi had theorized the Angel was hiding somewhere within that shadow. It was a big enough space to start with, but what lay behind that altered space was unknown. The obscuring waters made matters worse. As it was proven only a direct hit to the core can destroy an Angel, the chances of actually hitting anything with a direct attack were remote. Predictably, Asuka's first suggestion was to wrap strong steel cables around her Eva so she could dive right into the Dirac Sea and put a chain axe to the enemy. Just as expected, this idea was also quickly rejected. The JSSDF's suggestion to make the thing eat nukes was as easily denied.
The Angel's ejecting water, Ritsuko noted. We do not know where it's coming from. Likewise, we have no idea what may happen if we actually kill the Angel with a big enough blast.
Tokyo 3 had no intention of taking a superheated steam blast.
Or worse, if we fail.
That still leaves us with someone having to go in to find out what's inside,
Asuka added.
No! First you have to neutralize the enemy's AT field and its projectile attack,
Misato said.
We're going to release dummies to distract it while you get to the city. Asuka, you're getting the Mega Bolter gun and your chain axe just in case. Ray, we'll have to go with something more rapid fire in this case. Take the Positron auto rifle.
Inflated dummies of Unit 0 and 2 emerged from behind hill cover. At the same time, the defense guns started firing again. Just like the Battle of Ramiel, the Angel instantly fired at Ava-sized objects in range, or anything that attacked its floating spherical shadow. Communication sank into white static as Layla flared its field. Electromagnetism, Asuka thought as she sprinted down the hillside, flaring her own AT field. That's how those things can fly. Something slapped upon her field, lighting up the air around in a field of hexagons. Then, several pulses of needle-like beams. Computer targeting systems had some trouble aiming at the bomb scabs, which gave off no heat and moved in ever-changing clumps inside an even more chaotic swarm. Ray focused on keeping clear the space around Asuka. The Red Ava barreled forward, its AT field soaking up hypervelocity strikes. However, Unit 2 couldn't harden its field too much, lest it run into its own barrier. Slower moving or stationary objects didn't register attention on Asuka's attention for danger. An armoured steel plate popped up, and Unit 2 slid like a baseball runner to break against it. Unit 0 did the same and knelt for cover. There was a heavy bang, as the enemy's kinetic strike penetrated over 5 meters thick of layered steel and ceramic. The hole was just over their head.
The armour for our Evangelion's head is thinner than the torso,
Ray said offhand.
We must be careful of the enemy's accuracy.
So how does it know to target things anyway? It doesn't have eyes. Why is it leaving the smaller threats to those bug things? It's a matter of size and speed. It's sensing disruptions in its field.
Layla had stopped attacking. Asuka linked back to the command center.
Akagi-sensei, if the Angel's inside the Dirac Sea, then its awareness of three-dimensional space must be limited. It can't actually aim, per se, right? It's just reacting so fast it seems like it's being proactive.
A reasonable assumption, Asuka,
the scientist replied with a slight grin. She then turned to Misato and said,
This means visual cover is useless. As soon as the Avas move, the enemy will know it.
Kirishima!
The nerve colonel shouted into the link.
Did you move? We're still holding position, Katsuragi-san,
Mana replied. She watched cars, assorted debris, and some drowned people float by. The JSSDF comm channels were afire with distress calls. Her inability to help was maddening.
There must be a range to it.
Misato got off her command chair and began to pace.
I
After all, the Avers managed to leave from behind the hill safely, but then the cruisers were hit from kilometres away. We need to test this.
She turned towards Makoto.
Release some more dummies from behind buildings. Maybe the Trident doesn't have an AT field after all.
Large inflatable dummies were released from under caches in the city. The ones from behind the building survived until they showed themselves out to the open streets. There were even some trident-shaped balloons, which met the same fate. The two Evangelions broke cover to approach closer. Their steps drove waves through the flooded streets. The waters were already up to mid-shin of the Evangelions, tall enough to swallow smaller houses. Their AT fields defended them until they could reach the shadow of smaller buildings. Once again, Lalo stopped attacking as soon as the Avers stopped moving. Shape and form. Masato brought up a third comm window on her own control panel.
What's that, Shinji-kun?
How big's big enough? How fast is fast enough? Was the Angel ignoring the ships until they fired upon it? He scratched his nose and looked up at the ceiling of his entry plug. I heard that the Angel fired upon the Tempests, but only once. It couldn't see them enough to hit them.
That's fuzzy logic, Shinji-kun,
Maya added. She turned to Ritsuko and said, faintly excited,
I wonder, can we this from just this a sort of preference for the Angel's attacks?
I would rate that the presence of an AT field would override all other targets,
Ritsuko replied.
Then below that, any attacks crossing its shadow sphere. We also seen it fail to respond to attacks that just barely miss it. Then size. Speed, likely not.
She tapped the still numerous circling swarms.
That's what these things respond to.
I was wrong. A sniping spot could have worked against this Angel. Of course, Unit 0 would only have one shot, and disrupting its shadow seems to only temporarily knock out the AT field effect. We can't kill it.
Yes, but we can blind it,
Asuka shouted.
I have a feeling that the space inside my AT field is just empty to it. That's why it attacks so quickly and repeatedly. It doesn't know what may be in there. It's an obvious threat.
A sniper? Ray's voice held an oddly speculative tone. It was rare enough for her to volunteer on view. Colonel Katsuragi, may we approach if we call? I would like to have a dummy test this.
Soryu, if the enemy can be blinded by your AT field, it doesn't matter if it's hardened enough to serve as a shield. Extend it far enough and I can move. Then if I stop, Magnos Tancred may be blocky enough to look like a building once it's gone. Very good. Very, very good.
Masato smiled widely. This was how war against the Angels should be fought. Tactics being brought up, everyone adding their own strengths to the fight. How pure, how more worthy it was. The despair that stained them in their former battles seemed to fade away. Back to the beginning, an honest struggle between two powers. It was wonderful. She felt oddly grateful to it, even as she gave orders on how to kill it. And it worked. Slowly the Evangelions leapfrogged their approach. It was like that Lalo's shadow cast its own subtle light, and it perceived normal space through contrast between this light and its absence. The enemy's consciousness seemed to have place only for the threat and non-threat, the latter given only a moment for classification, then ignored. It was too simplistic, but the defenders didn't look a gift horse in the mouth.
Rescue choppers are arriving. We need you to distract the Angel,
Masato ordered.
Affirmative!
Asuka extended her field as wide as she could, while Ray behind it used her field as a shield. The Angel seemed to know where the Evangelions were, perhaps in that brief moment where the field transitions from existence to non-existence. Bomb scarabs swooped down and detonated against the edges of the field. Field guns and Magnos Tancred, in line with Unit 2, fired away towards Lalo's striped sphere. Heavy transport copters zoomed along at near water level. They hoisted trapped and drifting personnel aboard. However, while it seemed that the Angel was sufficiently distracted, the underwater spear prawns were another matter. They were attracted by light and loud sounds, like some sort of natural saboteur, and unfortunately both signals were provided by the choppers. Kill Team's Tritonus had not been idle either. Spears and drills met, and the latter prevailed, turning aside an attack and effortlessly punching through carapace. While the enemy had spears in numbers, they had traps and trickery. Neither the spear prawns or bomb scabs targeted boats, as long as those inside paddled instead of using the motors. They weren't fast enough or loud enough. Explosions and other signs of combat underwater drew away enemy attention, while the survivors packed themselves onto dropped boats or latched onto a chopper's trailing wires.
We're not doing anything to seriously harm each other,
Masato thought.
I can't allow any bombing until the shelters are really secure and all survivors out of the way.
The pressure wave through the city, water would smash all throughout the city. Still, things were going well. Too well. High energy reaction! Makoto Hyuga shouted. The Angel changed its motion. Instead of releasing water, now it's sucking it in.
What? Alert the rescue!
From the spiraling swarm above, concentric ring formations of the bomb scarabs descended and exploded. To human eyes, the additional light that their self-destruction gave was just a feeble increase over natural sunlight. But to Laylo it was enough. The entire battlefield seemed to light up, and it blasted a kinetic kill right through several buildings to strike at Evangelion Unit 2 at its chest armor. Asuka fell back, her breath knocked out of her. Unit 0 had gotten very close indeed, while crawling on the streets. She was making her way towards an armory building, where a hellbore waited. The waters were deep enough to almost submerge the Ava. Unit 0 began to sink. Rei quickly grabbed at the building's facade and tried to pull herself up. She flared her AT field, no longer caring for stealth, and almost immediately showed the signs of being bombarded. The buildings were sinking?
Ritsuko!
Masato shouted, desperate for knowledge.
It's a direct sea, Masato. It leads to another place. If it could bring out waters from somewhere else, logically it should also be able to take in things from this place.
Get everyone out of there!
The purple-haired woman shouted into the open comms.
Intensify all anti-air fire! Asuka, Rei, Mana, fall back but provide covering fire!
Mana grit her teeth.
If only we were in Hellfire mode.
There are other configurations as a subset of those modules. The dual P laser cannons could be replaced with paired Gatlings or more rapid-fire positron cannons similar to that Unit 0 was using. Magnos Tancred's 20mm anti-aircraft and 130mm anti-armor cannons had to suffice. The problem was the limited tilt of torso-mounted weapons. Unit 2 was protecting them all with its AT field barrier, trying to attack and defend at the same time, leading to mediocre results for either. It scaled a building, on full view of everyone, and held its arms up as if holding back a gate under siege. The bomb scabs gathered and surged down, its sinuous flight like that of a dragon. They slammed into the shield from the side. The Red Ava, having fixed the field relative to its body, toppled off the structure. Those inside Magnos Tancred winced, nearly knocked free of their seats and almost deafened by the shock. A kinetic strike had slammed into the armour on its right torso, just above the shoulder joint. The flamer there burst, and the Land Dreadnought's right shoulder lit up in fire. Bolt of fire ripped up from behind the building to chip away at the bomb scab's formation. Unit 2 chopped its way up the sinking building back towards the top. Then the air, already thick with tension and loose EM energy, grew unnaturally still. Something full of insane power roared. Beneath Laylo's shadow, something rose up from the depths. It roared again, hunching forward in challenge.
It can't be,
Asuka mumbled.
Evangelion.
Unit 4, Rei finished. She clutched at her rifle at both stock and barrel and held it in front of her. She heard it crack and felt the kick connect. The white Evangelion leapt through the air with the greatest of ease, and was upon the orange Titan-moduled Evangelion before it could evade. Its additional armour and energy reserves weighed it down too much. As Unit 0 toppled, the white Evangelion somersaulted away towards the red Ava. Unit 2's chain axe whirred to receive. Roars and sparks and the shuddering ram of two great powers colliding. Progressive bits chewed away at Unit 4's left forearm armour, but unconcerned its right arm punched at Unit 2's face. The force of their combined weight sent the two biomechanical monsters crashing through the roof and into the building's innards. A cold silence descended upon the city, lasting many minutes.
What the? Wasn't it destroyed?
Masato got up and glanced back at the old men on the commander's level. They seemed as surprised as she was.
Who's piloting that thing? No one,
Mai replied.
Are you sure? Can't we shut it down somehow? It's broadcasting on the standard Evangelion frequencies, even the microwave bands, but it's not accepting any nerve codes.
The S2 engine, Ritsuko asked with a quiet, if no less furious agitation.
Is it functional?
Yes, Senpai. It's still active.
The blonde scientist nodded and said nothing further, only stared up at the main screen. She leaned back slightly on her chain and touched her chin. There was a mix of joy and anger in her gaze, and Maya could almost hear the click, click, click as things began to fit together in Ritsuko's mind. The suction was surprisingly calm on the surface. It was hard to appreciate the water level lowering when the buildings themselves were sinking at the same rate. Magnell's Tancred, which couldn't climb buildings, waded back to outside the Angel's territory. If the Angel was really 3 nanometers thick, why was it that impossibly sharp edge wasn't slicing up everything in its path? It seemed to be doing the dips and rises in terrain well enough, when it should, since leaving sea level, been cutting through millions of tons of rocks with ease. This, Mana lightly commented on.
Do you really have the luxury of time to concern yourself with that?
Ritsuko said back. She was more annoyed at how the question broke into her thought processes than a proper procedure.
Don't you have anything else you could be doing to help Evangelion Unit 2? Saw you strong, Akagi-sensei, Mana replied. The best thing I can do is to help you stay out of her way.
2 Evangelions smashed out of the building and fell, still grappling and punching. They tumbled and rolled across the street, causing even more and even higher waves. Asuka seemed to be getting the best of the exchange, the white Evangelion only able to give an occasional jab in return.
I require a better weapon, Ray added. This positron rifle is not suitable for penetrating Evangelion-class armor.
Masato nodded.
I'm setting up the assault cannon custom.
It was essentially a cut-down 16-inch naval gun with armor-piercing shells. Full automatic, magazine-fed. Prog bayonet. It was hard for her to imagine anything with deeper dakka. Mana looked sullen at not being able to get a refit. She leaned back in her chair and put her arms back on the motion capture rig. The driver and the gunner did their duties well and without complaint, having learned it was best not to draw attention to themselves. Brawler configuration gave Magnell's Tancred a pair of useful hands, but a complicated assembly was less suited for punching. Thus, the arms were wrapped in a secondary bracer and gauntlet device that had a pair of punching spikes protruding from it. Blunt Evangelion fists, being modelled out of human ones, lost some energy in punching. Asuka's ferocity started to pall as fatigue started to set in and her wild efforts failed to break through enemy armour. Just a moment's pause in the attack, and wham! Unit 4 caught her with a savage uppercut. It then kicked at the other Ava's chest and stood up from being pinned into a parking lot. Naval caliber solid slugs and positron beams slammed into its back. The right Ava reeled, then leapt to avoid further fire. It cleared the buildings with ease and spread its arms out. The sunlight, filtering through the still whirling swarm above, gave it a cross-shaped silhouette. Asuka followed the transponder for her chain axe and dug it out from a collapsed building, and again pulled herself free of the Dirac Sea suction. It was like being in quicksand. Irrationally, she expected to float. Then again, she reasoned to herself, there was no reason either that just because it was called a sea, it meant it had to behave like a fluid. It was solid enough earlier, when the Evangelions were fighting. She looked up and gasped. The bomb scabs clumped together again, in a thick serpent-like shape. The white Ava stood at its head, its weight held up in mid-air.
No way! No fucking way! It can fly? That's not fair!
Asuka shouted.
Who the hell does it think it is, Sun Wukong?
Masato blinked.
Who? You probably know him better as Son Goku, Ritsuko said with a sigh.
Masato made a familiar cupped palm gesture. Ritsuko groaned.
No, Masato, just... no. Somehow it doesn't surprise me that Asuka would prefer to read the classics in their original form. Ritsuko, there's no pilot, and it can do this. How? Isn't it impossible?
Masato looked afraid and repentant for some reason. The blonde scientist laughed.
No, this is quite reasonable, actually, all things considering. Those things fly with reactionless propulsion. Incorrect. Instead of having lift, they're being lifted. I believe this is why the Angel stopped using its kinetic attack. It can't split its attention any further. The conditions of S2 engine activation and its own altered space is what allows the Angel to take control. I'm not sure what you're saying. Are you saying everything we've been fighting so far is the Angel? Very good, Masato. That is so. It's...
Ritsuko had to smile at the pun.
Shadow puppetry.
Unit 4 gestured and the second tendril from the rotating mass above shot down towards the attackers. Ray dived off her sniper's perch as a great clustering of bomb scabs ploughed into the building and shattered it down to its foundations. Magnell's Tancred was not so agile. It shot at the rushing form of its AA cannon and then slammed itself into a building as cover. It lay face up, presenting the thickest portion of its armour, hoping it would hold. Asuka's head cannon saw the bomb scabs plunge into the structure and in an ever-intensifying explosion, reduce it to rumble. "Kirishima!" she screamed. To die so uselessly. That wasn't fair either. Their war machines might not have been equal, but at least they deserved more than that. Evangelion Unit 4 roared again and gestured, and then she had different reasons to scream. Shinji Ikari looked up. Asuka's camera, the only reliable view into the battlefield, showed only static. He only dimly perceived the clamour at the command centre. The pilots still had life signs but weren't responding. Asuka. Mana. Ray. He grit his teeth and clenched his fists. Enough, machine spirit. Enough hiding. Lend me your power. He pulled at the controls and roared. Today, something dies! Evangelion Unit 1's sync ratio grew erratic. The Ava's roar echoed through the metal walls of the launch area.
Shinji-kun?
Launch me, Misato-san, the boy asked softly. The woman winced. She looked aside to Maya, who made a vertical slashing gesture.
Your sync ratio. It's still not good enough. It's too dangerous for you.
Another scream floated through the link.
That hurt, Ashgust! I'll kill you! Kill you! Kill... Oh, shit!
Booms! Kirishima, this is Ayanami. Respond. There was a tapping noise. Please respond. Evangelion Unit 1 growled. The boy's sync ratio just went up at least 10 points. I can't just stay here, Misato-san. Please, launch me! I won't abandon them. Never again. This world is ours, to defend, to hold and to cherish.
I knew it was psychosomatic.
A soft, triumphant cackle floated in from a side. Misato shook her head.
It's not prudent at this point.
Katsuragi. She turned and looked up at Gendo. Nerve's commander was in his usual pose. Launch him, he said.
Sir, you have no call in interfering with my battlefield authority.
Misato replied with a flat, defiant tone. He has to do this, Katsuragi. He can and must fight. If I can have confidence he can do it, why can't you? Everyone, even Fuyutsuki, looked shocked. No one expected Gendo, of all people, to berate Misato on her lack of faith upon her chosen child. The purple-haired woman looked disbelieving, unsure if she should be angry. It was a deliberate insult. But if Gendo, if he could say it, everyone else must be thinking it even more strongly. She turned back to her console screen and Shinji's pleading look. She shook her head again, to clear it. What just happened? That was almost, decent for the bastard.
Alright, but if we're going to launch you direct into the battlefield, water's going to get in. We'll have to seal the tunnel after you leave.
She indicated several points on the map.
Get your weapons from here and here instead. This one's close combat, the other has the guns.
Understood, Misato-san. He smiled grimly. And thank you. She smiled a bit mischievously.
Your girls are waiting, Shinji-kun. Don't disappoint.
Principio Eternus rose upon the rails. An elevator building popped up and opened. After a very long while, the Evangelion stood in sunlight again, though that light was broken by the bomb scab swarms, the right Evangelion's silent and tireless form, and Laylo's dark and inscrutable presence. Principio Eternus stepped into the flooded streets and roared its return.